Okay, so this part, I believe this is part 14. I am slightly starting to lose track of which number they are. Was a few weeks in the making, really. It was, and had to go through a few different versions and a few different, to be dramatic, deaths before I could find something that did justice to what I was sensing and trying to bring through. So what the structure of this presentation, I'm going to give you an allegory. I'm going to basically give you a symbolic narrative that I think has all of the depth that we are trying to get at in this series, and sort of contains all of that depth in this organic way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you sort of the allegorical narrative as best as I can do that. I'll then sort of unpack the narrative and then just basically continue to unpack it for the rest of the video, but it's going to go in fairly abstract or deep, in a deep direction, because once we accept a few different things, which the allegory is going to touch on, then a lot of other things start to fall into place and we can see the underlying system. And that's the underlying system of poetry, and more in a way. And so that's where we're going to be moving towards. And so I think there's a lot of explanatory utility in this allegory and in the ideas contained within it. So that's enough. Let's get into it. Actually, I will just add in that this does actually also touch at one point in the series very directly into how this plugs into poetic development and how we mature and the logic of that maturation, and what that looks like for poets across the 4 stages. Okay, that's enough in the way of a preamble. So what I want you to do is imagine a casual drinker. A casual drinker is going to be quite different from a connoisseur. Now, connoisseur is going to be able to, and this is very familiar sort of distinction. People are aware of the difference between someone who has no idea about the tannin or, like, I don't know, how citrusy or a wine is, or all of those subtleties of taste. If you recall, this is directly connected to the scholar, for whom taste is their preferred, their modus operandi, their sense. The casual drinker is casual, so they don't understand the subtleties of the flavour, the body of the wine. They maybe grasp only the broadest of generalities, white wine, red wine. And for them, the casual drinker, presumably drinking to become intoxicated, isn't even really looking for taste. They're looking for just some kind of collision, which is touch, with some kind of intoxicant. And so it's the effects of the wine as well that they are interested in, which is distinct from the connoisseur. Okay, so those are the two most, I want to say these are the most common sort of types of wine, of I don't know what you would call a person who is interested in wine. The people who are interested in wine, these are the two most common types. Whereas heaps and heaps and heaps of casual drinkers who don't know much about it. And then there's quite a few who have invested a lot of time and energy into learning the intricacies of it. Even going so far as to know, what vineyard a wine comes from, what part of France, etc. But not many people are perhaps aware of the fact that there's more depth that we can go into with wine. I don't know much about wine, but this is my best shot at trying to explain it. So at the next stage, we have I've got an Australian accent, so this will probably come across pretty horribly. A vigneron is a wine expert, not a connoisseur. A connoisseur knows all about the form of the wine, the form that it takes. But the vigneron is able to actually cultivate the wine itself. So they have the expertise to basically follow their nose to the kinds of soil and conditions that are going to be exactly right for the kind of grapes that they want to grow and the kind of wine they want to produce. And they have a much more familiar, deeper connection with the essence of the grapes and of the wine. So they understand how it is actually made and fostered, and what they need to do to cultivate, not only to understand more deeply the kind of grape that's coming through, the kind of wine that is trying to come through, but they are able to know what they need to do to bring it out, to bring it forth. And so they have a direct relationship with the grapes that are growing, the vineyard. The connoisseur thinks he does, but he doesn't. He is literally not in the field. He is literally, he may have visited the field, he may have a smattering of knowledge about what it is the vigneron does, may even be more than a smattering of what the vigneron does, but he doesn't actually do what the vigneron does. He still is approaching wine, not that he would admit this, but he's still approaching wine from the outside in. He doesn't have the direct relationship yet. He hasn't got his hands dirty, his feet dirty. He doesn't spend time. And see, this is the thing. It's not just a matter of the fact that the vigneron is in the field. It's the fact that the vigneron lives in the field. He has his life in the field. All he knows, if he is a good vigneron, is the conditions of the field and the grapes and the climate, and the acidity in the soil and the nutrients, the fertilizer, all of that stuff, we could continue to list all of these things that the vigneron is sort of embodied, because it's an embodied relationship that they have to the what would you call it, vintage, to the grapes. So the casual drinker turns up at the restaurant, the winery, every now and again. The connoisseur tends to live there, if they really love it, they will have ventured into the vineyard now and again, understand what the vigneron does, but they don't do what the vigneron does. Okay, so that's the next big distinction. Now we come up against our final type of, wine engager, which is what the French call, again I'm going to likely butcher the pronunciation of this, the terroirist. The terroirist, not terrorist, but terroirist, is, the word comes from being able to connect to the terrain, is someone who is brought in as basically an expert, someone whose expertise is more encompassing and has more understanding of the terrain. So the vigneron, this is how they're distinguished. The vigneron tends to the grape. It tends to the particular harvest. That's the word I was looking for before. They're tending to the harvest, and they know everything they need to about the nature of that harvest, the essence of it, and what they need to do in order to help foster that and bring that out. And they do that because they're so related to it. They're in the ground with it. But they don't necessarily possess to the same level, the understanding that the terroirist has about not just this particular harvest and season, but previous seasons and harvests, and how they what they reveal about not just the harvest that's coming up now, but future harvests, how that influences it. What the land itself is wanting to bring out, wanting what it is predisposed to bringing forth, what it might be best at bringing forth, what's well suited to it. So he actually understands the land, not just the vineyard, but the broader climate. And he's able to tap into what it is, in effect, the land wants. This, by the way, is related to the genius loci. So the term genius actually comes from the phrase genius loci, which means the genius or the spirit of a place. That was back in ancient Roman days before, perhaps. That's what it meant. It didn't mean a person endowed with special faculties and talents. It meant the spirit of a place. And what I'm trying to do here is effectively restore the word genius to this deeper, more original meaning, which is spirit of the place. So the vigneron is able to cooperate with the spirit of the vineyard. The terroirist is able to actually understand what that spirit wants, what the field wants to bear out, bring forth. And so we basically have, for very different ways of engaging with wine. Very, very different. We need to understand those differences if we're going to have any understanding of like the field of, in this case, winemaking. If a casual drinker tried to make a wine, would it be good or would it be bad? Again, it'd be better than someone who hadn't drunk wine at all. Yeah, it would be. But they don't really possess the expert knowledge to make it sophisticated, let alone beautiful, rich, profound, as profound as drinking wine can be, a work of art, something with a almost supernatural essence. Like the casual drinker is not going to be able to do that. Similarly, if someone at the next stage of development, the connoisseur, if they were to try and make a wine, would it be better than the casual drinker? Yes. Yep, definitely. Because they are going to be tasting their harvest, presumably, constantly. And they're going to be looking for some of those subtleties that the casual drinker is completely unaware of. But similarly, it's not going to be anything close to what the vigneron is able to create, because they have that intimate understanding of the nature of what's coming through and how to actually participate with that, and be alive to that expressing, unfolding nature in a way that the maybe too analytical or judgmental, superficial connoisseur isn't going to be able to. And likewise, a terroirist is going to be able to do something, again, more profound than the vigneron. And there's going to be, and see, this is where we're now getting into a lot of subtlety here, and that is the point of what we are trying to do in this system, in this series, is basically make people more discerning of the subtleties within, for this allegory, winemaking, but for poetry. So what is it that the terroirist is able to do that the vigneron isn't? It has something to do with this. Curiously enough, they might both have a relatively similar harvest or essence, but one has almost a spirit behind it, a spirit of understanding, a sense of actually knowing exactly what it is that is being given, and how that fits into, it's not just a knowledge of it, it's a knowledge of how it fits into the broader offering of the vineyard across seasons. It's playing a symphony, it's contributing a note to that larger symphony very deliberately and intentionally. And you know when you drink that wine that you're in the hands of a master artisan. And so that, broadly speaking, is the allegory, the allegorical sequence or narrative that we were aiming to clarify with this first part of the presentation. So for the next slide, I'm going to actually start to unpack what this means for poetry and poets. So again, we've got our 4 different types. Obviously, if you've been following this far, you are aware that the casual drinker is the sentimental poet, the connoisseur is the scholar, the vigneron is the censor, and the terroirist is the scryer. What I want to convey here is a few different things. One is, and this is an important point to make, the casual drinker and the connoisseur, literally, by definition, it's why they both have wine in their hand, are receiving the finished product. They are not in the field. So this is exoteric poetry. They're not in the field. They haven't stepped behind the veil into the winemaking process itself. They don't have a direct relationship with an apprehension of the wine being created. In this case, for poetry, the essence and the vision of what's coming through to be expressed. But that is what the latter 2 stages of development have. They're in the field. They have that direct relationship with poetry, with the essence and the visions coming through. They're in the field. So, and their senses are in the field. They're sent because they can follow things back to the source and actually step out from the cultivated restaurant into the wider field. And their sight, they're able to actually see what is going on and they're able to see the larger context of the essences that are coming through. That is esoteric poetry. So exoteric and esoteric. That's the first sort of big distinction that we want to make here, that I think this allegory very directly and handily captures. The second thing is that I think so I'll go through each of these stages and just talk a little bit about what this their allegorical depiction reveals about this kind of poet. So the casual drinker drinks to get intoxicated, as I said in the previous slide, because they're not concerned so much about taste as they are about the fact that it is just hitting them. It's making contact with them and rendering them inebriated. That's what the sentimental poet is effectively about. They just want contact with emotion, really, emotional realities, and they give that primacy in their worldview. That is what the connoisseur looks down on, and the connoisseur is a image that I think is quite well chosen. Just like the casual drinker reveals a lot about the way in which a certain kind of inebriation or intoxication is the aim of sentimental poets. There's a kind of drunkenness that they can get by exploring, expressing, elaborating emotional realities. And there's not much thought necessarily that goes into it, which is why, I'm sure I've mentioned this in one of my videos. Jack Kerouac, I believe, said, and this was the mantra of beat poetry was first thought, best thought, which I think what they were ultimately was sentimental scholars. You can easily, some of them would have been sentimental poets. I don't think we'd put them in the essential poets, but if you remember the sentimental scholars and the senses, if we haven't yet learned those distinctions, they can look quite the same, and so they can look quite the same, and that means that some people might think that they're actually doing something like essence, but it's not really. But that's an aside. Beat poets are actually probably a good example to bring up, because they were so obviously they were mired in alcoholism and drugs, and so they're probably quite a vivid example of that kind of tendency towards inebriation. But you see it in but it doesn't have to be as literal as that. It just means getting drunk on an emotional reality, being carried away by it, basically. Okay, because that is what the state of inebriation is. It's being carried away by a kind of emotional current very often. Okay, so that's why I think that image for the casual drinker, for the sentimental poet, fits quite neatly. And similarly, as I was saying, the connoisseur is quite a good image for the scholar. Why? Because when people think of a connoisseur of wine, that has become the stereotype of, and it carries in a lot of people's minds the connotation of a very stuck-up, pretentious person. There is something that looks pretentious about caring so much about these fine-grained subtleties and specificities in wine, of all things. And there's a kind of smug. This is in the popular image of a connoisseur of wine, is that they are, that there's a kind of smug, almost, excuse the language, almost masturbatory kind of self-adulation at their sophistication. For wine, of all things, and that they take so seriously. And I think that captures quite well the nature of the scholarly poet, which is often removed and abstract, but with zero self-awareness of the fact that they are not, as they think they are, the top of the hierarchy. Even in wine circles, they believe themselves to be the top of the hierarchy when they are not. The vigneron, the one who, and the terroirist, the ones who actually create the wine that they love and admire and think sophisticated, they are doing something deeper, and therefore must have a more knowledge of the craft of wine, the nature of wine, than they do. But that seems to be curiously lost in them. And so what we get is, what we've clarified here basically is the deadlock in exoteric poetry between these two stages. Because that smugness only makes sense if you don't look at anything above you and you only see below you to the casual drinkers. Because if that's all you see, not anything above, just the casual drinkers below you, who are very far below you, they don't know anything about wine, and they just look at them, they're just, getting drunk and becoming emotional. There's a way in which that makes sense to be that smug, but that is the deadlock. We see the interplay between the two of them, because the casual drinkers, the sentimental poets, are going to look at the scholars above them, the connoisseurs, and they're going to be like, well, why would I want to be that? That's just pretentious and out of touch, and who cares that much about wine anyway? And so many of the arguments in modern poetry, which is all exoteric, is about that. Is about basically about that core argument that I just pointed out, how they view each other. There are, of course, so those are the arguments between the stages of development. there's also the arguments within the stages of development. Some sentimental poets are going to say you can't write about that emotion, write about this emotion, or you can't, and right, that's going to be some kind of thing. You can't write about the emotions behind this political reality, therefore, I disagree with your poetics, and vice versa. And you can get the same in scholarly circles. That's actually just as likely, if not more likely, in terms of just the kinds of arguments that can happen, is that it's scholars, connoisseurs arguing amongst themselves about pretty irrelevant, tedious details. That's not citrusy on the tip of your, palate, whatever the fine-grained analysis is that they are quibbling over. So, that's exoteric poetry. The vigneron is, as I already said, represents the kind of poet who can actually step into a direct relationship with essence, the essence of what's coming through, because they actually know it intimately, because they have worked with it, they've tasted it, they've come to know it. So it's not just taste that they've come to know, but it's a real sense, right, and a scent of the soil, the foliage, the general climate. They sort of have this embodied sense of it. And so because of that, they actually know the essence. They have the heart of it, of the kind of juice that is trying to come through and out, and which is contained within the fruit. That's a direct relationship and knowledge that the connoisseur just doesn't have. And because there is that relationship, I would say that's also like love. It is a tending to essence. There's a depth of relationality there that's just not present in the connoisseur. And so I think that captures the sensing poet. And then we've got the terrorist, which is, again, as I've already mentioned, is that visionary or scrying poet who understands the essence coming through, why it's coming through, and is able to do things with more of a deliberate sense of understanding. And that's what you get in Blake and Dante and Shakespeare. It is, and Goethe. You register, just like I said with the terrorist, you drink their wine, but then you also get, it's like a deliberate note in a larger symphony. And you get the sense of a spirit of something else beyond just the essence. That is what you get in all those poets. There's a sense of something else there, a reason. A very deep, profound reason. And so, as I said, so we, the genius loci, that's what a genius is. A genius is someone who can participate directly with the underlying spirit that is trying to come through, the underlying essence that's trying to come through, and vision. Now, whether it is, because these are the two kinds of esoteric poetry, you can do it, let's say, instinctively, like the vigneron does. He does it without a full understanding of the terrain. Or you can do it with understanding, and you know why the essence is coming through at this point, and where things are going, where things have come from, the overall purpose and the overall plan. So just like in the allegory, these two makers of wine are able to tap into something beyond themselves, right? There's the vigneron does that in a slightly more superficial way, still much deeper than connoisseur, but it's still superficial compared to the vigneron, who does it through understanding. But both are relating to the genius loci, the spirit of the field itself, the underlying the field that's coming into the field with a particular purpose, and expressing in a certain way for that purpose. And that's what a genius is. A genius is not an isolated, just weaving something out of the bowels of their own mind in isolation. It's actually with a direct connection to, it's, as I said in a recent poem, it's almost like the shuttle of the place presents itself to us, and then we participate in it. We put maybe our own stitch into it, but it is ultimately we're fulfilling the design that's already been planned for us. And we are doing it in our creative way, but we're participating in it. We're co-creating it. It's not just this thing we do in isolation in our own minds, which is, I think, how exoteric poets and thinkers in general, and the public, view genius, because they lack the deeper relation to the thing which is the source and the font of poetry. And when you have that relation, then you actually, I think you understand. Let me try and put it a different way. You need the relation to the font, because otherwise it is something that is just a projection. It's just something that you've created to. Yeah, but that doesn't make sense. A genius is someone who taps into ideas, and ideas are not the same thing as a construct. An idea is a living reality. It is reality seen, and in that sight formulated. But it's the reality itself. And this idea that we're supposed to make constructs is such a scholarly way of looking at it, and it is perennial in academia. The idea that there isn't a deeper relation to like the actual complexity of life itself, and therefore we need to make up hypotheses and theories about it, but we can never really come into relation with it and understand it on its own terms. And that's what I just clarified there does also go back to, I haven't actually recorded the video yet, but it's going to come before this in the series, where I talk about Coleridge's system and how he too curiously fell short of understanding this relationality, and he spoke of what does he call it? The secondary imagination. Basically, for him, the highest kind of poetry has a vitality to it. The mind of the poet has a vitality to it, is alive, as opposed to mechanically dead, in the way that a scholar is. But even in talking about that vitality, he's not saying that he's not talking about essence. So he's in this juncture point between the scholar and the censor. What he needs to say is that the highest poetry, the minds of the highest poets, are vital and alive in relation to, not just in and of themselves, that's not enough, but also in relation to the vital and alive essences that are coming through. And then that actually completes the picture that he was, I think, feeling out and trying to apprehend. You can't just have the mind by itself, even if it is a genius and vital and alive, write great poetry. That is missing the fundamental point that makes it all make sense. There needs to be something that's actually that the vital, sensitive, sensing, or scrying poet plugs into and is able to bring into form and convey and express. So that was a lot that needs to come through there. I will have to elaborate on the Coleridgean sort of point, and that's basically it, but I'll bring it up in another slide on my other video anyway. Okay, so now that we've sort of mapped all of that out, what we're going to do is and how they map onto the stages of poetry, what we're going to do is we're going to start looking at the core sort of, let's say, dynamic system underlying this. Make sure we understand that, and then we'll start applying that a bit more, start filling in the gaps, filling in the details. Okay, so if we accept everything that we've just spoken about, if you don't accept it, I'm not entirely sure why you were 40 minutes through part 14 and still following and engaging this. But if you don't accept it, roll with me anyway, and let's see where it leads us. So if you accept all of that, I think what we have to, when we talk about the genius loci, the spirit of the place, the underlying spirit of the place, well, we have to, if we accept that there is some underlying spirit that is coming into form as essence that we can then relate to and express, then there needs to be the what is it that the philosophers call it, the primum mobile, the first mover. There needs to be something that starts it, that starts the impulse. There's some kind of impulse in this spirit of the place, spirit of poetry, that decides, I'm going to come into expression now. And that has to be there. If we're just following out the equation. If we accept everything else, then that has to be there. So we're going to call that the life impulse. Then, if we accept that, then what we can add to that, I'll just read this out. Then what the life impulse does is it slowly creates the means of its expression. That is what it does with the vineyard. It is trying to come through and create the grapes, the foliage, the stems, the soil. It's trying to create these things which are going to be in the soil becomes the medium for the seed, which is the medium for the stem, which is the medium for the foliage, which is the medium for the fruit, which is the medium for the juice, which is the medium. And then but beyond that, it creates also as I say here, the wine drinkers and the makers themselves, who then taste that fruit and help those fruits come into being and understand their purpose and their plan, so that ultimately we can come to know what is coming through for expression, and ultimately follow it back to its source. So this is what this is love, basically. I'm going to explain that in a little bit more detail in on the next slide. But I say it's love that drives the wine drinkers and the winemakers to enjoy the fruit, and to help those fruits come into being. So this isn't going to fully make sense just yet, but I think the next slide will slot, the next two slides will slot this into a very simple configuration, because that is ultimately what I'm trying to do. I know this is probably the most densely, this might be the hardest slide, because I'm having to just make a few different steps, but now I'm going to fill it in. So, if we were to abstract and formulate this all, we would have the following sentence. Life, it's a life impulse, manifests and expresses as the light of the fruit. Because it creates the fruit, it creates everything which creates the fruit. And it expresses as the light of the poet. And it is this light, it is the same light, which makes the poet love the light of the fruit in lesser or greater degree, whether you're a casual drinker, connoisseur, and so on. Because there's deeper loves. Just you would say that the connoisseur loves wine more than the casual drinker. But that love is actually driven by this life, by this light. It's woven into the system. The very thing that draws us towards light is light and life itself. And so we could say that light is making itself responsive to itself, until it is eventually, as the loves grow deeper and deeper, is led back to life and is able to sort of co-create with it. It understands the purpose and the plan of life and is able to actually start weaving it in some kind of a co-creative relation with it into the world. Heavy stuff, or heady stuff I should say. There's a lot going on there. That's the most complex, most dense or deep. I would choose the word deep more than abstract. It is abstracted totally, but it's not abstract in the scholarly way which is to lack relation and to look at everything through this form first lens that approximates essence but never actually gets there, and approximates relation but never actually relates. I would say that this is actually more of a relation to what we're talking about, and that makes it deep in a way that scholarly, let's say, metaphysics isn't. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to formulate this, as I said. We've done the hard part, and then we're going to make it much more concise and condense it right down. So life is the impulse, light is the manifestation of that impulse, and love is the means by which return, conscious, knowing, understanding, return. Eventually it's knowing and understanding, but the means by which return is affected. It's the catalyst of that kind of return, the anti-entropic force. What I mean by that is, let me just take a moment because there's a lot that's here, and I'm going to find the most concise way of explaining it. And this isn't just in the human kingdom. We see this in atoms. An atom is a whole, it's a unity. It is, for however long of a time, a single thing. And we can say that that is love, because without that, that's what entropy is. It disperses, and so it isn't able to become it isn't able to move towards the greater whole of life itself, which is the ultimate anti-entropic force. And so it's through stable atoms and molecules and minerals and plants and animals and our bodies that we are enabled that we move closer to towards the source of life, which is very abstract and deep, I know. But what I'm trying to point out is that love can be a for lack of a better term, an unconscious thing, such as what an atom does, or a molecule, or a body. You know, we aren't necessarily conscious of it, but it can become conscious, as it does in the sequence of development that we're talking about, from all the way from sentimental poets all the way up to scrying poets. So that's what we're going to talk about, that hinge point, the next slide. So, the hinge point is when light begins to affect a pull, that's love, on the consciousness, that's light, within the animal form of man. Prior to there being this kind of consciousness in man that is responsive to light, is pulled by it in a loving kind of way, some kind of attraction, there is an animal form. It's pre-conscious, that is all about sensory experience. It's just behavior, really, at that point. But eventually, animal man, starts to turn this sensory experience into a sensuous or sensual experience, which I would say the distinction is that sensual or sensuous is consciously elaborating and expressing that sensory experience. So consciousness starts to come into the picture here. And that is what the sentimental poet is working with. By pursuing the sensuous and the sentimental in this conscious way, by being called to explore it, they grow in consciousness and can be said to hold more light or consciousness than those who are still identified with their animal forms. That's when it tilts over into more of this direct conscious relationship with light and life. Still not fully conscious yet. That doesn't happen until the sensing stage. So, as I said at the beginning, we're going to ground this in, we've had to come a long way, not just in this video, but in this series, to be able to ground this in something practical. But we need to lay all this groundwork in order to be able to do it properly. Because what is the key to development here? There's a couple points to make. So I said love matures telically, as in telos. So each stage has an end. So telos is the end that you are driven towards. Every stage is aiming at something different. When you give that end its due, and you reach for it, without any anxious reaching for anything above, the love is completed, I want to say consummated, and it then, and only then, becomes translucent to a higher good, a higher love, the stage beyond it. In other words, you don't climb by despising the rung you're on. That's not how it works. You climb by fulfilling it. So to use a Jungian term, you follow what is numinous for you. Or to use Joseph Campbell's words, you follow your bliss. In other words, you can't skip the alchemical process, because all of these do map on, as we've done in the previous alchemical video, onto different stages in that process. You can't skip it. You can't just go, I'm in the Negrito stage, I'm going to skip ahead to the coagulation phase at the end, or the distillation phase. It's not going to work. That's not how it happens. You can't do that. The next step of any process only makes sense once you've completed the one before it, and then it actually becomes organic, and it can only ever be organic. It can't be a forced change. So that means that the masses, who are still accumulating the sensory impurities that they find really numinous, are still doing the work. For it is through that they come to the Negrito stage, the first sort of step of the alchemical stage, of the sentimental poet, in which they burn it off. So, to put it slightly differently, completion leads to translucency, which leads to gradual advancement. And now what I'm going to do is just go through the different how, I'm just going to spell it out, how each stage opens onto, backs into the next one. So, sensory experience, if it is indulged in long enough, backs into the unexpected recognition that it can be elaborated, extended, and consciously expressed. Sensual experience, sentiment, that's what that last one just ended on. If that's indulged in for long enough, it backs into the unexpected recognition that there is an objectivity beyond subjectivity. That there are many experiences and forms that can be tasted. That's when we start getting into the scholarly. Scholarly tasting, cultivated for long enough, backs into the unexpected recognition that there is an informing spirit behind the various forms governing and shaping them. So we get into the sensing. Sensing of essence, cultivated for long enough, backs into the unexpected recognition of the underlying or overarching vision / logic that's governing the essence. Right, so each one of them, pursued for long enough, completed, starts to back into something larger. And you can't hurry that along. That's the only way you can come to sense something higher, is by slowly increasing in your scope. And you can't speed that up except by pursuing what is numinous, and over time you'll just gradually increase and accumulate that scope. So what we'll do, and so to tie this up, what I'm going to do is discuss what is happening to consciousness and the developmental sequence in each of these stages. So what I'm going to say here is fulfilled love thickens the witness behind it, builds up the consciousness. So the masses have a love of sensory experience. They're limited consciousness, so there's very little scope. They're insensitive and they're immobile. You can't really relate to them as consciousness. I'm talking about, really thick kinds of people who are all instinct and behavior. And obviously there's a continuum here. Sentimental type, love of the sensual, so they're starting to love that. and their consciousness grows to include subjectivity. They're limited in scope, and they're fluid, but not in any kind of a really organised way. But they've got more fluidity than the masses. The scholar sacrifices that fluidity because they become quite rigid and certain that they know best and all of that. But they have a much larger scope than the sentimental. So they sacrifice the fluidity, gain the scope. The sensor is able to become mobile and fluid, but in an organised way. And they grow to understand the informing essence behind the forms governing and shaping them. And the final one, the scryer, is mobile, fluid, but also greater in scope and understanding, and they are capable. Their consciousness is able to do a lot that other types can't do. They create tradition because they're able to do so much with form, and also, even though that's not the point of what they're doing, they're able to do that, so they're capable. Okay, so what have we been doing here in this very long video? It's an hour long. And what have we been doing so far in this video and in the series? By means of poetry, we are coming into a sense and a relation and understanding of the deeper underlying system that it's enfolded in. You might ask me, if you want to do metaphysics, why not just use the different metaphysical schools of thought already out there? There's a couple of responses here. One is that most metaphysics is done from the scholarly mode of taste, rather than through sensing or scrying. In other words, they aren't the right tools for the kind of job you want to do here, which is to offer something with more depth and relation. They are also overly complex, whereas what we are trying to do here is create a bare essentials explanatory approach. Pardon the pun of essential. Where we can explain the most with the least. Whereas I think most metaphysics out there explains the least with the most, I suppose. And then finally, I would say, but that isn't to say that there isn't a precedent for what we're building here, because in a conciliant sort of fashion, we have found a kind of parsimony with Plato and Plotinus and theosophical sources. So, for instance, the progression of love that I'm talking about here, the way that we progress through our loves is and deepen them until we actually come to love light and life itself, is what Diotima talks about in the Plato's Symposium. She calls it the Ladder of Love, which is very appropriate, given that the title of the series is The Ladder of Poetry, which could also just be called The Ladder of Loves, poetic loves, perhaps. And I just added that as a slight side note. Just like we need to be tutored in a field to refine our loves and come to love more appropriately, so too with poetry. So there is a connection with this, with Plato. And we've also got a connection with Plotinus, life, light and love. That's our terms, but it does correspond to Plotinus. He has a whole hierarchy of being. It proceeds from the one, from what I would say is life. And then we've already spoken about how the stages of development map onto his stages of being and knowing. So we've got that. And there's also provenance in original theosophical sources too, Blavatsky and Alice Bailey and things of that ilk, the original sort of sources. So that does bring us to the end of this long presentation. Thank you for listening, and as always, love to hear your thoughts. If and when you have them, please don't hesitate to reach out. I think we are going to likely have to let this video settle. I won't add any postscripts or anything like that, and if anything does come to mind, or if I can think of any ways, if it seems appropriate to try and ground or go back over any of the stuff that we've covered here, then we can do that in an additional video, or however many is needed. So that wraps us up, and again, thanks for listening.